This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends.
Hello and welcome to Evangelical. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. Thanks for tuning in. I'm not sure what drew you to this show today, but I'm glad you're listening. You can probably tell by the tone of my voice that I don't know. What words are there to describe how we feel here in the United States? 12 days ago, a racist massacre occurred in Buffalo, New York. The gunman was a white supremacist young man who drove across the state to enact his crime. Then this week, 19 children gone. We live in this unending cascade of tragedy stretching back decades. Columbine, Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, Charleston, Las Vegas, Buffalo, Uvalde, and thousands more names and places affected by gun violence. And words are cheap and hollow, and it wasn't an election that was stolen, but our hope was. Our leaders are beholden to interests they value more than the lives of innocent children, of people attending church, of people going grocery shopping. My first coherent memory of watching a news event unfold in real time was the Columbine shooting. I was actually in high school back then, but by happenstance I had just had an appendectomy and was home for a week recovering. Since then, we've seen it happen again and again and again. In schools, in churches, in synagogues, in stores, at concerts, on streets. Children are taught active shooter drills. I don't know what to say anymore. What words can you ascribe to leaders who have the power to enact change but don't use it? Cowardice? Sociopathy? Callousness? Indifference? Evil? What words can you use to compel them to act? They're immune to shame, and they assume our attention will barrel on like a bullet down the barrel of a gun, finding some new target, because that's the way the attention and information economies work. What words can you use to comfort your child to look them in the eyes with anything but the knowledge that no matter what measures we take, no matter what neighborhood we live in, that violence may find them? I don't have any answers, only really more feeble words, and the sadness I carry that's gotten a little heavier with just another reminder of how cruel our country is, and a reminder that those who boast the most about supposedly loving this country oppose the very actions required to ease suffering. Words are bereft of meaning for the bereft, and we're all bereft, but most especially those who've lost their children and loved ones. I don't really know what to say. I'm piecing this together. And in times like this, I tend to retreat back to the things that I know well. The things that I can speak to. So, because I don't know what else to do, I'm going to re-release this episode, this interview you're about to hear, that I had with Robert Jones back in 2020. Robert Jones is the author of a book called White Too Long. He also now publishes a Substack under the same name. One of the things that really struck me in the book and in this conversation was a passage in which he highlights some research from 2000, 22 years ago. Research from a generation ago about what Jones reframes as the restricted moral vision of white evangelicalism. And I wrote about this a little bit elsewhere. You can find that in the show notes. But let me just quote something from the book. There's two key metaphors. One is what he calls a cultural toolkit, and the other is the restricted moral vision. And here's the passage from the book. Quote, as sociologist Anne Swindler has noted, all groups have what can be thought of as a kind of cultural toolkit, a repertoire of shared ideas and behaviors that allow them to organize and interpret reality. This toolkit necessarily acts like a filter, allowing some things to come sharply into focus while blurring other things into an indistinguishable background field. Through the workings of this cultural filtering, some things seem like common sense, while others are less comprehensible or appear obviously nonsensical. In a groundbreaking 2000 study, Michael Emerson and Christian Smith applied these insights to the results of thousands of quantitative and qualitative interviews with black and white Christians, particularly on questions related to race. They found that white evangelicals' cultural toolkit consisted of tools that restricted their moral vision to the personal and interpersonal realms while screening out institutional or structural issues. Specifically, Emerson and Smith discovered that the white evangelical cultural toolkit contained three main tools that are interconnected by theology: free will individualism, relationalism, and anti-structuralism. Spelled out, free will individualism means that, for white evangelicals, individuals exist independent of structures and institutions, have free will, and are individually accountable for their own actions. Relationalism means that white evangelicals tend to see the root of all problems in poor relationships between individuals, rather than in unfair laws or institutional behavior. Finally, anti-structuralism denotes the deep suspicion with which white evangelicals view institutional explanations for social problems, principally because they believe invoking social structures shifts blame from where it belongs, with sinful individuals. End quote. If your morality has been shaped or affected by white evangelical influence, you can sense the truth of this assessment. The deflection of social justice critiques of requests for gun reform that center norms and institutions to some vague notion that what we need is revival, and that a heart strangely warmed is enough to affect broad social change. It's that assumption of individual sin as the underlying cause of social ills that leads to phrases like, guns don't kill people, people kill people. So, let's take another opportunity to question why we tolerate such violence. Let's take this opportunity to tell the truth about our country. That there is so much pain here. And to deny it, and to deny its causes, is wrong. I don't have any meaningful segue for you. I'm just going to switch over to the interview here. Much of what I've said here has been adapted from a couple of different posts I put on my website, the Post Evangelical Post. You can find it at postevangelicalpost.com. You can find out how to support the show there. You can get things like ad-free podcast feeds and stuff like that. I don't have it in me to do the rigmarole, I'm sorry. But I'll put the links in the show notes, and I'll tell you to read these books. In 2022, you shouldn't need books to persuade you of the realities of racism and of gun violence in the United States, of all the different social ills that overlap and feed into one another. But they can still inform and transform you. So, let's listen to this interview with Robert Jones. Again, context. We initially had this conversation during the 2020 election cycle as part of season 1 of the Powers and Principalities podcast. That is a separate podcast feed, and the first season is complete and addresses white evangelicalism and Christian nationalism. If you have any questions for me, you can email me at contact@evangelicalpodcast.com. Stay safe, everyone. My guest today is Robert Jones, founder and CEO of PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute, and author of the recent book White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. Robert, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Really glad we're able to talk about your book. It's very important for understanding our current moment as well as our history. And I have to say up top, I recognize the reality of two white men talking about race. But however, I think that your book is one of many that's out right now that this moment needs in order for white populations, including white churches, to begin having conversations about race and reckoning with the legacy of white supremacy. Your book is actually a combination of personal experience, history, and sociological data. But I want to start with your personal experience and how that informed your own process of reckoning with white supremacy. What began that process for you?
Right. Well, I think it's really been a lifelong, process, to be honest. So I grew up in Mississippi for the most part as a Southern Baptist, so very much inside, the kind of the largest Protestant denomination and inside that evangelical world. And I was that kid also who was there, every time the door was open. I mean, I would, no kidding it, sometimes, like many people who are active in evangelical churches, I was there maybe 4 or 5 times a week, depending on what was going on, all the way through. Was a member of the youth group and, went to a Southern Baptist college. I have a Master of Divinity degree from a Southern Baptist seminary. So, very much inside that world. And, I think the first crack that I kind of identify in the book for me in that kind of edifice of innocence is maybe one way to think about it, where I began to get a more critical look at our own history and heritage was when I was sitting in a Baptist history class in seminary. I was in my early 20s and heard for the first time the origin story of the Southern Baptist Convention, my home denomination. And, that is that in 1845, there was a dispute over whether it was legitimate for a Christian clergy person to enslave other human beings based on the color of their skin. And Northern Baptists came to a point where they rejected that claim and would not endorse a minister who was going into mission work. And the Baptist churches in the South disagreed, and in fact put this as a test case up very intentionally to kind of force the issue. And when the Northern Baptists kind of backed off, they basically withdrew for what had been a kind of cooperative endeavor at kind of funding missions efforts, and instead formed what became known as the Southern Baptist Convention in 1845, explicitly over this issue of not only allowing, but actually endorsing the idea that someone could be a minister of the gospel and someone who enslaved other human beings at the same time, that these were perfectly compatible things. So that was in my early 20s. I'm now in my early 50s. So that was 3 decades ago. And I would say that kind of over time, there have been other little things that have intruded, but it really has been the last 5 in my consciousness, but it's been the last 5 years, I think, it particularly The shooting of Trayvon Martin, the whole kind of beginnings of the Black Lives Matter movement, and then everything from Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Michael Brown, and these kind of just drumbeat after drumbeat, and more visible, I think, nationally than it had been in the past. Not that these things were new, but this very visibility. And then two other events I think in particular that really pushed me to write the book were the events of Dylan Roof shooting 9 African Americans as they were at Bible study at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, and then the white supremacist marches in Charlottesville. We just passed the 3-year anniversary of that event, where we had people openly chanting these neo-Nazi slogans of blood and soil and Jews will not replace us. Mm-hmm. And so I think it was the movement of this, so overtly that it wasn't even dog whistles or whispers anymore, but it was people shouting and declaring, overtly a kind of white supremacist worldview, and a real lack of, I think, accounting, sort of, it was a personal book, really. And so, my own trying to make sense of this legacy that I think kind of helped me, push me to write.
Right. I like that term that you used of edifice of innocence, of just that like there's this presumption of a sort of benign history, right? But that's not really the truth of history itself within these denominations. And that's what I appreciate about your book, is that it really doesn't spare any root or branch of white American Christianity. I mean, speaking for myself personally, I grew up United Methodist, went to a Wesleyan college, and even the holiness tradition, separate from the Baptist traditions, had their own schisms around slavery in the 19th century as well. But you're also critical of white evangelicals in general, and your own Southern Baptist tradition in particular. But you also do highlight the ways in which mainline denominations and white Catholics are and were also complicit. What are some examples from white American Christian history that show how these racist ideas, even though like people like us, I'm in my late 30s, so I'm younger than you, but I also grew up in that sort of milieu where, a presumption of innocence was sort of de facto. But what are some examples from that white American Christian history that show how these racist ideas and practices were enforced across these denominations? And
as we said, I mean, the book is really part memoir. So I do start, with the kind of evangelical world, the Southern Baptist world, kind of expanded out to the evangelical world, and I thought that was appropriate, given it was a memoir and kind of wanting to get your own house in order first. But it's true that once I started digging and doing the historical work, it became very clear that this was not by any means something confined to Baptist or the white evangelical world, but that really all the branches of white Christianity, so white mainline Protestants, from which the United Methodist Church is a part of, along with Presbyterians and Episcopalians, the United Church of Christ, that world that it is often perceived to be the more progressive end, of the white Protestant world. Even there were just these gut-wrenching, examples. And then among white Catholics who are predominantly in urban centers in the Northeast and historically and have their own history of being persecuted as Catholics. Even there, there was these things. So just a couple of examples. I mean, it's worth noting that virtually every Protestant denomination, white Protestant denomination, split over the issue of slavery in the Civil War. So it wasn't just Baptist North and South, but it was Methodists, Episcopalians, Presbyterians, that all divided. And so the Southern branches of those denominations basically aligned with the Confederacy and supporting slavery and providing religious justification, moral legitimation, and cover for the Confederacy, right, in the name of Christianity. And those were very overt. They weren't passive. They were very overt. And just, one example, in the United Methodist Church, for example, the denomination splits. And even when it comes back together, this is like in the 20th century, there and they were including some African American churches in that reuniting of Methodist North and South. but even then, they segregated the African American churches and clergy into this fictitious thing called the central jurisdiction. So instead of allowing them to just kind of be active in the natural kind of among their geographic neighbors, which is the way the Methodist system is set up, they kind of just confined them all into one place. It was essentially a religious gerrymandering exercise to reduce their power, and to also make it so that local white Methodist clergy did not actually have to interact with African American clergy in their own geographic area when they had kind of regional meetings, because all the African American clergy had been grouped together, no matter where they were across the country. That effectively reduced their ability to have influence inside the Methodist denomination. And the Episcopal Church is also interesting. Again, it's, I think, often thought of as, a kind of more liberal group, but it's worth remembering that Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, these were all Episcopalians, and some of the churches in the South, in Richmond, for example, the headquarters of the Confederacy, there's an Episcopal church there that was the home church of Davis and Lee, that actually installed stained glass windows depicting Lee and Jackson and Davis as essentially as Christian saints, literally in the stained glass windows. So this goes very, very deep, not just among Baptists and white Catholics. Just one example there. The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops and the Archdiocese of New York actually did a very similar thing to the Methodists, and that is that if you were Black and Catholic in New York, and again, this is not in the South, it's a very urban center in the Northeast, and you wanted to go to Catholic school, you were certainly able to, but they basically designated one parish, St. Mark's Parish, as the school they segregated, and all African Americans, no matter where they were in the city, if you wanted to go to Catholic school, that's where you went. And they were also encouraged to go to that Catholic parish for worship services. And well into the 20th century, African Americans were required to sit in the back and to wait until after all the white members of the church had received the Eucharist before they could receive the Eucharist. So these lines of segregation and hierarchy, racial hierarchy, were really dominant through all of our history. I mean, it is really, you can't really read the history straight without realizing this kind of white supremacist assumptions, like running all the way through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the things your book also highlights is the way in which it is not confined to the South, as you mentioned with that example in New York. It's not these prejudices. This type of racism is present in the Midwest, in the North. It is absolutely not confined to the South. I'm from Indiana. There were sundown towns in Indiana.
Right.
Yeah, there are all sorts of examples of this, and your book provides an ample number of them. One of the other things that your book highlights is the ways in which teachings about the lost cause in the South, as well as Confederate monument building by groups such as the United Daughters of the Confederacy, were intertwined with religious teaching and became part of the cultural fabric of white Christianity. And we continue to reckon with these monuments to the Confederacy even now, following the protests after the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and others. How did these statues and other types of memorializing serve to normalize and valorize this cruel and racist past and sanitize this sort of very real violence and death that it caused?
Yeah. Well, there's the group you mentioned, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, is a group I knew very little about. I mean, I'd probably seen their name in passing, but it hadn't really registered just how active they were. This is a group, it's kind of a women's auxiliary group that formed really it was not right after the Civil War, but a few decades after, in the 1890s and into the early decades, really between 1890 and World War One. That was a very powerful group. There was over 100,000 women involved at its peak. They were mostly from white, wealthy families, connected to the Confederacy, kind of to old families that had supported the Confederacy. And their mission really was to make sure the Confederacy wasn't forgotten. And even though the war had been lost, to erect these monuments. And they talked about them very much as educational things for children, right? So that that it was for the next generation. They were worried that the ideals of the Confederacy would be lost. But many of these same women, right? I mean, they were the same women who were also very active in churches all across the South, and you can see them picking up church practices and adapting them for this kind of pro-Confederate educational system. And one of the most striking ones that I came across was that they actually developed a catechism
Yeah.
For children. And so, what it did is, and for those who, may not be familiar, a catechism is essentially a kind of educational tool used for children, usually for confirmation services.
Mm-hmm.
And it basically teaches you the facts, right, about the faith. And so, and it's a kind of it's a question and answer structure. Who is God? And then there's an orthodox answer that the child is supposed to memorize and say back. So the teacher would ask the question, the pupils kind of recite in unison, back to the teacher. And this is kind of how it was, a kind of rote method of education. And so they developed, a Confederate catechism. And instead of who is God, who is Jesus, who created the earth, those kinds of questions in the catechism, it was, what was the cause of the Confederacy and how were slaves treated, and those kinds of questions. And, the answers were, the North not being willing to let the Southern states have the right of self-determination, and how were slaves treated. The children were memorized. They were treated well, and, were happy to work for their masters, and like these kinds of things. And those sound kind of bizarre in tandem, but if you can imagine, also put them into the lived world in which they were created, and what you realize is that what was not an uncommon thing would be for a kid to go to they had youth chapters of the United Daughters of the Confederacy had
Mm-hmm.
Youth chapters, and so it wouldn't be uncommon for one of those kids to go to Saturday morning meeting and be instructed in this Confederate catechism, and then to show up for Sunday school the next day at their church, and perhaps even have the same teacher teaching them the Christian catechism. And so if you're a kid, these things get melded together in a way that one is about kind of the South and one is about Christianity, and they're very, very compatible and kind of just inculcated as part of your worldview. And these statues then they talked about them as things that kids walk by every day. That's why they're on places like the county courthouse square, and the center of town. They're there as a just undeniable declaration that we lost the war, but make no mistake, who is still in control and who is still running things here. There's still white supremacy here, and lest you make any mistake about it, here's the 60-foot granite column with a Confederate soldier at the top of it to kind of remind you of who's really still in charge.
Right. And what are your thoughts on the way discussions around these monuments have progressed or regressed since the protests for racial justice began in May? It certainly seems to have changed since your book was even finished, which was recently.
Yeah, well, I turned the manuscript in about a year ago today. And when I did, I certainly would not have imagined that we would have the events around the Confederate flag and these Confederate monuments that we've had this last year, because those monuments have all stood there for well over 100 years. It's worth noting just quickly that one of the most important things to understand about those monuments is that they weren't created during the Civil War, even in the few years right after the Civil War. Mm-hmm. Most of them were actually created in the 20th century, and they were created as whites were kind of clawing back control from Reconstruction after the Civil War and implementing Jim Crow laws, implementing segregation, and voter disenfranchisement. And so it was part of that movement of whites really reclaiming dominance after a loss in the Civil War. So they were very much part of that movement, and not really. It wasn't really just a memorializing movement. It was literally a movement about reclaiming white supremacy in the face of kind of Civil War defeat. But what's notable actually is that there has been movement since then. So we've had a lot of action on the ground, but on public opinion, we've actually not seen a lot of movement about Confederate monuments. When I wrote the book, we had about 6 in 10 Americans saying that they saw them more as Southern pride, and only 35% seeing them as symbols of racism. That's moved only slightly. Our most recent data has it from the summer has it at 59% Southern pride and 38%. See them more as a symbol of racism. So really, only a 3 percentage point uptick in people seeing them as racism. And when you look at white Christians in the country, white evangelicals, for example, have actually become. There's been not a lot of movement among white mainliner Catholics, but white evangelicals and Republicans overall too have actually moved more in the direction of have become more entrenched. They're more likely today than they were a year ago to say that these that monuments are a symbol of Southern pride rather than a symbol of racism. So it seems that one effect on this issue is it actually has further polarized people on these issues rather than kind of moving people more kind of to one direction or the other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's made them more calcified in their position in that regard.
Right. Right.
Well, using that as a segue, I'd like to return to white evangelicals in particular. Your book highlights an extremely helpful framework from two other researchers, Michael Emerson and Christian Smith.
Mm-hmm.
Quoting from your book, you write that, particularly on questions related to race, they found that white evangelicals' cultural toolkit consisted of tools that restricted their moral vision to the personal and interpersonal realms while screening out institutional or structural issues. Specifically, Emerson and Smith discovered that the white evangelical cultural toolkit contained three main tools that are interconnected by theology: individualism, relationalism, and anti-structuralism. That passage really rang true for me as someone who's lived in this community and believed in these things. What are they referring to regarding a cultural toolkit? And if you could you summarize these three main tools and the theology that connects them?
Sure. Yeah. So it sometimes I think sounds a little more complex than I think it is. I mean, that research is so helpful at kind of just dissecting it, and letting you kind of laying it out on the table where you can kind of see the parts
right
there. So I am indebted to Emerson Smith, and then behind them is actually a sociologist named Ann Swidler, who actually coined the term tool, like a kind of cultural toolkit. I think it's a helpful way of thinking about it. That one of the things that any worldview and kind of cultural situation that we grow up in gives us, think of culture as kind of giving us lenses to see the world with, right? They're kind of explanatory frameworks. And so when we see things, we have these kind of explanatory frameworks that we see through. And so it's one of the reasons why two different groups of humans could see the same event and interpret them in wildly different ways, is that we have these kind of lenses that really shape and make meaning of what we're of kind of the raw data of what we're seeing out there. And so it means that it helps you see some things, and it inevitably makes it very difficult to see other things, depending on what the tools you have at your disposal are. And so in the evangelical world, this idea of individualism and relationalism go together. So on the one hand, individualism, I think the easiest way to kind of connect that one up is to think about how evangelicals, and this has actually gotten to be kind of wider than even evangelicals, but how kind of white Christians, I think, and particularly white Protestants, think about salvation. And it is this kind of individual relationship with Jesus. I mean, if there was anything I heard, and I guess it's remarkable to think about this, like if there's anything I heard, maybe every service, it was this phrase, a personal relationship with Jesus, or some variant of that phrase, every time, right? What I never heard and what I cannot remember hearing at all was any references to racial inequality, structural racism, the way that institutions are arranged that disenfranchise one group and privilege another group, any of that kind of analysis. And so, kind of going to the actually the title of your podcast, right? The Principalities and Powers. Pieces. I think that's probably the most sociological piece in the New Testament is that language of kind of how to understand these powers that are enforced by institutions and laws and policies that kind of press down and limit what we can do, and they limit people in different ways depending on where you're located in society. And one of the principal ways, of course, U.S. society has located people is by race. And so, so this individualism, I think what it does is it just makes prominent and even almost exclusively makes religion about maintaining this very personal relationship with Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really what the beginning and the end of religion, in that view, right? That as long as you kind of have this interior sense of connectivity with God through Jesus, that can be maintained through devotionals and Bible reading and going to church, but in an odd way, even going to church is less a corporate event and more a corporate event, and or at least as an end, and more of a corporate event in the service of still this individual relationship, which to kind of help you cultivate just this individual relationship. But what that screens out, right? What isn't in that cultural toolkit is a way of seeing structural injustice. And so, Martin Luther King talked about the effect of this individualism as one that kind of puts white Christian consciences to sleep. I mean, he had this phrase and letter from Birmingham jail where he was writing to, these very mainstream white Christian and Jewish leaders in the town that weren't, extremists, weren't people burning crosses. But he talked about in kind of dismay, like why they weren't joining and defending the civil rights movement. And he said, like, who are these Christians sitting safely behind their anesthetizing stained glass windows? Right. So that sense that one of the things it does is it kind of screens out or blinds or lulls one into a kind of sense of complacency about injustices that are happening outside the church or outside one's own individual psyche, right? So it leads to a kind of an apathy among white Christians around systemic injustice in the country. That's the individualism piece, and the relationalism is very similar to that. That it's about kind of, if you're going to solve a problem like racism, you solve it through relationships, right? So one-on-one, it's still highly individualistic. So I'm going to be friends with someone who's African American. I'm going to make sure that I don't hold any ill will toward anyone in my circles who is African American, and that's really all that's required of me, right? Even though I'm living in a neighborhood that has a restrictive covenant that doesn't allow African Americans to live in this neighborhood that I've chosen to live in, even though I'm going into a church that would not allow African Americans to join, none of that is really relevant, or even it doesn't even enter one's consciousness, right? It literally is screened out by this cultural toolkit. And then remind me the third one. I'm like losing that train.
Oh, sure. Anti-structuralism is the
and the anti-structuralism kind of follows from this too, right? That that you solve problems with individual relationships and not with structural changes, right? But that does allow, I think, these bigger structures that have been built. Like I said, laws, who can get what jobs, who can live where, who can marry whom, who can get what kinds of loans, like all of these things that were literally white supremacist policies because they valued and protected and privileged white lives at the expense of others, and literally gave advantages to whites that were reserved for whites only, and all of that again just kind of gets rendered invisible if you can't really address the institutions, if the main way you solve problems is through individual relationships, and if the primary religious concern in your life is a private interior relationship with Jesus. All this other stuff out in society, society as a whole can remain as unjust and unequal, perhaps as it will, because it's really hard for, I think, those things to even find a leverage point to enter into white Christian consciences.
Right. Even the very most important thing that is presented to us is the salvation story, and what it means to be saved and how your salvation is lived out. Whatever side of the coin you're on, whether you're Arminian or Calvinist, you still need to work out your salvation. And for it to be put in that sort of framework, which that limits you from being able to even engage properly or in the same way as people outside of your religious community with social issues, was just extremely valuable as a reader to come across that and to see it put into those terms. It's such a sort of pernicious problem.
Yeah, it's pernicious and it's remarkably powerful. I mean, I can say this as someone who grew up in that world too. I mean, just to give one more quick example, I remember, so I went to public school in Mississippi, in Jackson, and it wasn't until the early 70s when I was in elementary school that the first Black kids showed up at our school, right? And so that meant that Mississippi had drug its feet for nearly 20 years after the Brown v. Board of Education decision came down demanding that schools desegregate. But when it finally happened, you would think, right, that this was like a major event that your church would help you make sense of. And there was not a word uttered, in my church, or a way to kind of think about this as a Christian. What was this about? What do we think about it? I mean, it was just utter and complete silence, on that issue.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that this sort of limited toolkit is restricted only to evangelicals? One a term I just used was like that it being pernicious, and one element of some parts of evangelical thought and culture is that it finds its way into other denominational spaces or cultural spaces. Given that the Conservative Party, the Republican Party, is populist and at this point largely tolerant of racist beliefs and practices by this administration, do you think that this toolkit could be seen as applicable to broader swaths of the white American population?
I do. And, it's worth remembering that, when I sort of tell the story of the founding of the Southern Baptist Convention, explicitly over making enslaving other human beings on the basis of race compatible with the gospel, mm-hmm. that denomination, the Southern Baptist Convention, right, was no small, kind of fringe or denomination. I mean, by the mid 20th century, it was the largest expression of Protestant Christianity in the country. And so as such, it played a very outsized role, not only in its own denomination and not only among evangelicals, but heavily shaping certainly Methodist, views and others. I think it really became such a strong and dominant expression that this did absolutely bleed into other denominations. And it's worth saying, though, that it wasn't like I wouldn't use like a viral kind of metaphor. Like it wasn't like the other denominations were devoid of it and got infected. I mean, they were there. It was there already. And just one quick example I'll work in here that I think was helpful to me was to realize that even though like there were these kind of white Christian churches on both sides of the slavery question, there were very few white Christian churches that weren't all on the same side of the white supremacy question. And these were very different questions. Like I actually, before I started working in depth on this book, I can say that I often conflated those in my mind. Like I thought of the Civil War as a fight not only over slavery, but over white supremacy, right? And that it set us on a different course. And of course, the abolishment of slavery, you can't really overstate how huge an event that is and was for the country. But I ended up reading a lot of Frederick Douglass and particularly his post-Civil War writings and speeches. And there he was just beside himself at how quickly whites in the North and South were mending the fences and with the issue of slavery settled. And the main bridge that he named, was that they still had a commitment to this idea that whites were a superior race, right? And that African Americans were inferior. And so whatever the new plans were for the country after the abolishment of slavery, the one thing that most white Christians, mainline, Protestant, Catholic, all agreed on was that white Christians were, and that whites were an inferior or a superior race, and they had Christian justifications for that worldview, and that was really dominant. It was dominant well into the 20th century. So it was all there. It had different kinds of expressions, but like even Charles Finney, who was an abolitionist, a staunch abolitionist, after the war had a protege of his who was going to organize a mixed race worship service, and Finney stopped him in his tracks and said, no, you err. And I think what he said was, you err in supposing that the principle of abolition and the principle of amalgamation are the same. And he was absolutely against the former, against or for abolition, but absolutely against what he called amalgamation, that is mixing of the races in a Christian context as if they were, on equal footing. So that's there, I think, all the way through, and even among Catholics, it's there as well, even as they're facing their own sorts of discrimination.
Right. Yeah, and that's a very important distinction that you've made. That it's not just from within the evangelical circles or anything like that. It was more sort of current sentiment that I was thinking about, not necessarily the historical. The historical side of things. I recently read Stamped from the Beginning, which also put this into sort of clear contrast, which is just a history of racist thought in America. And it's clear that it goes back, and it's not, you use the metaphor of virality or of something being planted, but it's more like white supremacy is the soil. It's not really a plant that's seeded somewhere. It's actually the thing that it all grew in when we're talking about white American Christianity, which is something we have to reckon with.
Yeah.
Let's actually talk about the racism index, which is part of the book, and one of the more sociological-oriented parts of the book. I'd like to have you explain a little bit about the structure of the study, but prior to doing so, I actually want to frame it with one of the conclusions of the study, which is that, quoting again from your book, the models reveal that in the United States today, the more racist attitudes a person holds, the more likely he or she is to identify as a white Christian. Can you talk about your findings and what we can draw from them?
Yeah, that, and if you want to add one more plain language one, you can actually flip it around the other way. And if you analyze the data the other direction, you could say that identifying as a white Christian makes one about 10% more likely to hold racist views. It kind of works the other direction as well. So, one of the things I tried to set out is I lay out a lot of the history, that we've been talking about, but I also want to see, okay, well, what differences does history make for current attitudes around racism, and particularly around structural racism, as opposed to kind of more personal, attitudes toward racism. But how does it, how operative is this cultural toolkit still? Does it hide things? Does it help people see things or inhibit them from seeing things? So I came up with a thing I called the racism index in the book, and it's basically builds on a lot of sociological literature about how to measure attitudes on racism in public opinion surveys. As you imagine, you have to be kind of careful about doing that. You can't just sort of ask people straight up, do you consider yourself to be racist or bigoted toward African Americans? You don't get very accurate answers when you ask questions like that, because people don't want to be perceived, in certain ways. So it kind of builds on a lot of political science literature, and then added, I think, some additional nuance to that for the current moment. And so it's 15 questions. It covers a fair amount of ground. So it covers things like the killing of African American men by police and disproportionate sentencing and the criminal justice system. It also covers just general questions about how people perceive the legacies of the past impacting the present. So does past discrimination limit African American economic mobility? Does it limit their opportunities today? Those kinds of questions. And then a set of questions that are just general questions about racism in the country. And one remarkable thing is that these questions all correlate quite highly together. So in other words, if you answer one way on one question, you're very likely to answer the same way on a different question in the index, because they after doing a lot of statistical tests, you can see that they're actually measuring some common underlying concepts there. So I scored this index, essentially one way of thinking about it is scoring it on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 holding the least racist attitudes on these structural questions, and 10 holding the most racist attitudes. And what I found was that, not surprisingly, when I analyzed the white evangelical attitudes, that their average score as a group was 8 out of 10, so pretty high on this racism index. But what was maybe more surprising, both to me and probably to your listeners, is that when I analyzed the views of white mainline Protestants and white Catholics, they scored essentially 7 out of 10. So not quite as high as white evangelicals, but right behind them. And if you look at, and a good comparison group, if you look at whites who claim no religious affiliation, they only score 4 out of 10 on this index. So, and then African Americans score about 2 on this index. So if you ask the question, like, So who is closer to the views of African Americans on issues of race and racism, particularly systemic racism? The answer is not white Christians. I mean, the answer is whites who claim no religious affiliation are actually much closer. And there was this consistent 30-point gap between whites who are not Christian and whites who are Christian of any kind across all these questions. And so, one way of kind of boiling it down, additionally to the kind of way we started this, is to say, look, if you take your average white person and you add Christianity, they actually move toward holding more racist attitudes and move further away from the views of African Americans. And this is true, by the way. I kind of check for all kinds of possible alternative explanations. So perhaps, for example, this pattern is there because white Christians tend to be more Republican, or they tend to live in more rural areas, or in a region that's more culturally conservative, or education levels are different. And anyway, I put it into a model of more than a dozen control variables to kind of hold these other alternative explanations constant. And even with those in place, it turns out that these patterns persist, and they barely move, really, when you put these controls in place, which tells you that it really is the Christianity that's doing the work here, and that is the differentiator between whites who are not Christian, whites who are. It is the religious views themselves. And then the other thing I tested for was because the other objection that might be lodged is to say, okay, well, maybe this is just because maybe this is just Christians in name only. Maybe these people just claim to be Christian, but aren't really connected to a church. They're not listening to sermons. They're not really reading their Bible. They're not connected to a Bible study group, that kind of thing. So I actually looked and tested to see if religious attendance made any difference. And it turns out that broadly speaking, among all white Christians, it makes no difference. And in other words, that the relationship between holding racist attitudes and identifying as a white Christian is just as strong among those who attend less often as it is among those who attend more often. And if you look just among white evangelicals, it turns out that those who attend religious service more often, that relationship between holding racist views and identifying as white evangelical is actually stronger. So in other words, attending in terms of holding more racist attitudes, attending religious services more frequently among white evangelicals actually makes things worse.
It's pretty stark to see that within quantifiable sociological data. One of the things you mentioned is also there's a disparity between a sense of warmth, I believe is the term you use, towards African Americans and them holding racist views. Do you think that's explained by this sort of this lack that they have in their cultural toolkit, that they feel like they can relate interpersonally with individual African Americans, but then still maintain this racist worldview?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think it's a really good illustration of that toolkit at work. So, one way that people sometimes measure attitudes is by what's in kind of public opinion circles called a feeling thermometer. And you basically say to people, okay, I'm going to read you a list of a number of groups, and I want you to tell me on a scale of 1 to 100 how you feel about them, with 1 being I feel rather more cold toward this group, and 100 being I feel more warm toward this group. And so when you ask a question like that, and you ask about African Americans, white evangelicals and other white Christian groups also score fairly high on a warmth, scale. But there is this kind of paradoxical thing that among white evangelicals, for example, they score simultaneously the highest among religious groups on the warmth scale and the highest on the racism index at the same time, right? And so that is the sense of I can feel warmly toward an individual African American. I don't want to hold anything in my heart. Even that language "in my heart," right, is kind of part of that toolkit,
right?
But at the same time, these other things, the killing of African American men by police, for example, 7 in 10 evangelicals think these are just isolated incidents, that there's no connections. So there's that anti-structuralism, right? Not being able to connect the dots structurally. And they can't see it. They either can't or won't see it. And again, 7 in 10 say they're isolated incidents instead of part of a pattern of how police treat African Americans. And so you can feel good about my relationship with an African American, who I interact with at work, and at the same time have no stake in the game of like police reform because I just simply don't see the problem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I want to talk also about this story you have within the book about two churches that were once one. They were actually a single church, and then they split along racial lines. And their ongoing dialogue with one another, including this recent trip that they took as a group to the National Memorial of Peace and Justice, which remembers the victims of lynching across America. Now, we haven't discussed the history of lynching or the ways in which the white church actively participated in those activities, not because it doesn't deserve attention, but because a discussion of it would require more than our allotted time here in this call. But I would like for you to highlight at least some parts of this story in particular, this way in which these two churches have gotten to begin a dialogue together, and how their dialogue might be able to encourage similar congregations or even others that are, trying to address this personally as they think through these issues.
Yeah, of course. I'd love to talk about this. This is, a really moving story, and it's a personal one to me. It's a story of a white and black Baptist church in Macon, Georgia. This is the hometown of my parents. In fact, kind of Bibb County, Georgia, in which Macon is part, is the place where both sides of my family go back for about 6 generations into the early 1700s. So I've got quite a bit of family history, back there.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the white church, First Baptist Church of Christ in Macon, is actually the parent church of the church in which my parents grew up in East Macon Baptist Church. They actually launched that church as part of their kind of missions efforts in the city. So I've got a kind of indirect connection there. But it's a moving story, and there are pairs of churches like this all over the South, in particular, and that is churches that used to be the same church. And the original church, in this case, in 1825, when the church was formed, it was formed by slave-owning whites who brought enslaved people to church with them. And so on a given Sunday, you would have whites sitting in the front and enslaved Africans in the back. And this was the kind of, seabed of the church. And then it lasted that way for a couple of decades. And then as tensions were heating up in the Civil War, they split. And basically what happened was the African American were outnumbering the white members of the church. And as abolitionists things were heating up, it became tense. And so they essentially kicked out the African Americans and built them a church kind of down the hill. But under the supervision of a white pastor, of course, but nonetheless kind of split. And then after the Civil War, the African American church got its own kind of independence from there. And then the two churches, in a fairly small community, just simply ignored each other for 150 years. And then about 7 years ago, the two pastors basically got to talking over coffee and just said, look, what are we doing? Like, we have this shared history. We're here in the same community. We're trying to solve some of the same problems. We should know each other, essentially. And I think in many towns, there weren't that many mechanisms for Black and white people to even get to know each other. And so they decided to build that bridge, and began with simple things like Easter egg rolls for the kids and potluck dinners there's kind of a park that sits kind of in between the two churches, kind of neutral territory there. And, it's made a huge difference, I think, for both churches. But I think in particular, for the white church that has really had to confront its past and to tell a truer story about itself. And one that I think has led them, to a place of more authenticity. And I think just greater understanding of where they are and what's demanded of them, I think, in the present. And one of the, outcomes of this is that they did take a joint trip over to Montgomery to the National Memorial for Peace and Healing, which, as you said, is this memorial for the victims of lynching. And it's a very moving memorial. I spent some time there myself working on the book. But it's remarkable, right, for a kind of two churches to take this trip, one bus half the group is white, half the group is black, and then they came back and had like a discussion and worship joint kind of reflection service around it, and it's led, I think, to some really transformational ways that the white church is thinking about itself and its own history and what's required of it, in the present. And one of the things that it's done is that they talked about beginning this journey with wanting to, I think, the white church particularly wanting to move toward reconciliation. And as they move through this process, he actually told me, he said, I've actually stopped talking about reconciliation so much. And we're talking more and more about repair and justice, repairing the damage and doing justice. And that's really become the way we understand the end of this work now. And we trust that, reconciliation will come as an outgrowth of that work. But we've kind of actually shifted the way that we understand our own responsibility, in the work. But it's a beautiful story. And I think actually, the reason why I haven't in the book is because, I don't think there's any 10-point plan that everybody can follow to kind of fix, the problem that we have. But I think it's journeys like this on the ground, feeling their way along. I mean, these are the ways that I think we're going to finally begin to mend and repair the damage that we white Christians have been really responsible for centuries.
Mm-hmm. You close the book by inverting the traditional, and by which I mean traditionally racist, idea of the mark of Cain, which is used in a lot of different racist ideologies. And you say that it is, in fact, white people that bear this mark. That's a really powerful symbol, and symbolism really does have it's affecting, it's evocative, especially for those of us with a religious history or framework of our own.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on this and how you hope it might be able to help white Christians begin to reckon, which is another word that comes throughout your book, to really reckon with white supremacy and refuse to perpetuate it?
Yeah. Well, that piece actually came to me from visiting that memorial to the victims of lynching in Montgomery. And in one display they have there, one of the projects that they've done is to try to document the sites of lynching that have been kind of forgotten about or suppressed. And as they documented the sites, they have collected soil samples from the sites of the lynching, and they've displayed them back in on a shelf. And there's this long, floor to ceiling shelf of these clear glass jars, kind of gallon size clear jars. And they have the soil that they collected and just a simple black and white label on them with the name of the victim or victims, depending on the case, and the date and the place where the lynching occurred. And, there, in that biblical passage of Cain and Abel, which is where the story comes from, there is this line that you hear actually in the Old Testament a fair amount about when that God is saying to Cain that your brother's blood cries out from the ground, right? So even in something that he's tried to keep hidden, that he has hidden his brother's body, he's lied to God about killing him in the text. And of course, God knows the truth. But this line about your brother's blood cries out from the ground, and it really hit me that this suppressed and hidden history has been one of maintaining a kind of white Christian innocence against all evidence to the contrary. And that if we're really going to heal from this, and I would say, I mean this in two ways, and James Baldwin really helped me here, I think, in getting my head around this issue that I had often thought of healing as something that needs to happen between Black and white Americans, and that's certainly true, right? There's no doubt that that's a massive and important project. But I think the thing that we white Christians have thought less about, and we white people in general have thought less about, is the damage that we've done to ourselves by holding on to a compatibility between white supremacy and Christianity. And you can only do that by great efforts at distortion and disfigurement. So it means that, and that requires an immense amount of psychic energy to really try to hold those two things together at the same time. And yet we've done this for centuries. And so there's a real sense in which, we ourselves are sick. I mean, we have really disfigured the faith. And if we're going to recover, it's going to take, a real reckoning and a real sense of being able to grapple with this. And that finally, that's the way to freedom. I mean, in that text, the way that Cain finds his way out of this dilemma of killing his brother and then lying about it, is that he finally is able to tell the truth, and God finally maps out an alternative history or an alternative future for him. And I think that's kind of the moment we're at. I mean, that we have kicked this can down the road. We've had multiple opportunities for accounting for it, and we just haven't really been willing to pay the price of doing that. But by not doing that, we are continuing our own kind of ailment, really. And so if we want to find a place to help, to a healthier faith, to a healthier set of institutions that we pass on to our kids, we've got to really do the work of dismantling the ways that we have allowed white supremacy to really sit right alongside of and in the pew next to the gospel.
Yeah. I totally agree. And I thought it was such a powerful image to share with your readers. Wendell Berry wrote in an essay once about how he feels bound to the type of Christianity just because of it being part of his heritage. Mm-hmm. And I think that this really enhances that, in that it puts in full relief how central this sort of distortion is to the history of white Christianity here in America. I think it's just a very, very evocative tool to sort of end our conversation on, because it really does give us those opportunities to reflect on our own histories as well as the history of our country and of our faiths. So I want to thank you for joining me today. Where can people find your book? Where can they find you online, or anything else you might want to mention here?
Yeah, well, the book is available wherever, people like to buy their favorite books. If you want to support a local bookshop, you can go to bookshop.com and kind of buy it there, and even, pick a local bookshop to support. It's available on Amazon, of course, and other places. And if you want to follow PRRI's work, we are at prri.org.
Robert, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
That'll do it for this week's episode. As Robert said, you can pick up the book White Too Long at any bookstore location near you and on Amazon. If you do want to support the show, you can use the affiliate links in the show notes in order to purchase it and send a small percentage of that back the show's way. This episode was produced by Jake Lewis. The theme music is by Dave Lefevre and Jake Lewis. If you enjoyed this conversation, please rate and review Powers and Principalities on Apple Podcasts and let others know about the show. All right, talk to you soon.